I'm beginning to record the session now, and I would just like to welcome everyone again to, as Barry said, the May collaboration team meeting, which is a joint meeting between the Atmosphere and Terrestrial Ecosystems teams of IARPC. Just some technical notes before we get started. This meeting is being recorded and we will be taking notes. So if you wish to view this at a later point or to share with a colleague, we will post all of that within, I believe, a few days. I'm sure we're all Zoom pros, but please remember to mute yourself while we have other speakers talking. And if you have any questions, we will have a discussion at the end, as well as you can also post your questions in the chat and we can ask those at the end. Great. So again, my name is Andrew Villeneuve. I am a member of the IARPC Secretariat, and I'm really happy to present today's guests and the meeting topic, which is on top, down, and bottom up observations of Arctic methane, which Barry will introduce in a second. Before we get into the presentations and the meeting business, there is a short update from the diversity and inclusion team from Colleen Strawhacker, and we're really thrilled to have her here just to give an update on their activities. So Colleen, I will give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to both the atmosphere and marine ecosystem or terrestrial ecosystem teams for allowing me to crash the party for a little bit. So hi, everyone. My name is Colleen Strawhacker. I'm a program officer at the National Science Foundation. I'm also a co-lead of the Coastal Resilience team. And this I'm a co-lead on the diversity and inclusion team, but this is actually my last diversity and inclusion presentation because I'm stepping down to allow some new and exciting voices to take on the team and be a little bit more realistic about my commitments as well moving forward. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that the diversity and inclusion team is up to some really exciting things lately with some momentum from the new administration, given that diversity and inclusion is one of the pillars of the new administration. We have a lot of momentum to do some really exciting things. So we've started a new reading group. The last meeting was on allyship. We're talking more about kind of co-production of knowledge and how to incorporate Indigenous voices in Arctic research, and are open to any new ideas and kind of exciting things that might be on your plate. We also just wanted to reach out to the rest of the IARPC community to make sure that you were aware that we exist, that we would love input from the other IARPC teams. And I just wanted to say, kind of welcome, please join us if you're able and willing and interested. And I just wanted to open it up that if you have any ideas or questions about kind of what the diversity and inclusion team is up to, I'm here to answer those questions. And so I'll just end it there. And please let me know if you have any ideas or, you know, anything moving forward with regards to diversity and inclusion.
Thanks, Colleen. So the next, any questions from anyone? Well,
Colleen,
go ahead, Peter.
I just quickly get in the comment to Colleen that Margaret Torn is just spinning up a biogeosciences section at AGU, a committee on diversity and inclusion. So you might keep an eye on what AGU Biogeosciences is doing in the coming months.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for the heads up. I know AGU is up to some really exciting things in this space, so there's a lot to keep our eyes on there. So thanks for highlighting that too.
All right. So to speed things up on the roll call, we were going to ask everybody to share in the chat your name and affiliation, and if this is your first collaboration team meeting. And while you're doing that,
Barry, you've muted yourself. Sorry.
Thank you. Some of you, if you're new to IARPC, I wanted to introduce this group to you. It's the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, and it's bringing together leaders from 16 agencies, departments, and offices across the US federal government to enhance research in the Arctic. And so the idea is, this is a chance for the Arctic community to meet monthly in these different collaboration teams to talk about what should our research priorities be, and what are some of the new exciting results that we have. And because Earth system science is so interdisciplinary, we often do joint meetings with other collaboration teams like this one. The atmosphere, we're all aware how the carbon cycle, CO2 and methane are so important to understand their emissions and uptake by the biosphere, and both the anthropogenic and natural emissions of these gases. And so I'm really excited today to have experts that have been studying both on the ground, how do microbes emit methane, what's driving that in the Arctic where things are changing so rapidly, and also some remote sensing observations of sort of this bottom up versus top down. It's exciting that the United States has rejoined the Paris Accords, and one of the things coming up on the calendar in 2023 is the first global stocktake. So this is a reporting by all the member nations of the Paris Accords. What is what is that nation's contribution? And it includes both sources and some sinks of these greenhouse gases. And so while everyone's putting in their introductions, it's great to see some new people, at least new for the Atmospheric Collaboration team, chiming in on the chat. I wanted to introduce Ruth Varner. Ruth is a professor at the University of New Hampshire, and she has been studying methane emissions since her PhD, and doing several recent projects around the Arctic, and this will be a great opportunity for her to tell us what she's learned so far. So Ruth, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Let's see.
Yeah, that's working.
All right, does that look all right? And you can hear me? I can't see you, sorry. Someone say yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I was muted. We can
That's
hear you.
okay, thank
That's
you.
fine.
Just want to make sure I'm not talking, to the void. So, or I sort of am. Anyway, thank you so much, Barry, for that introduction. And thank you all for asking me to present today on our NASA-funded project. We call it From Archaea to the Atmosphere, and A2A for short, so you'll see that throughout the presentation. I just first want to take a minute to acknowledge the many contributors from a large team of interdisciplinary researchers. As you can see, there's a long list here, and I've probably forgotten a few, which is not good, but it takes many people to study Arctic ecosystems. And so I'm excited to present, but just to remind you that this isn't all just my work. And I also wanted to acknowledge our site collaborators. So we do a lot of research at multiple sites across the Arctic. And so I would be very remiss to not acknowledge the folks that have been doing long-term research at many sites across the Arctic. And so thinking about trying to integrate across the Arctic is really both the focus of this work, as well as I'm sure the other work you're going to hear about today. But also, more importantly, I'd like to acknowledge the many Indigenous and First Nations peoples whose land and we work on and do our research at, and thank them for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. This project has been built upon many years of collaboration. As Barry mentioned, I've been measuring methane for a very long time, both in temperate, tropical, and Arctic ecosystems. But this collaboration in particular has been built upon work that was funded through both the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy, as well as our current NASA grant. We're trying to understand the importance of these below ground microbial communities in producing, consuming, and eventually emitting methane to the atmosphere, which, as you all know, is a strong climate forcing trace gas. And I think we all can agree, I hope, that that there are many unresolved questions with respect to the role of the Arctic in the global methane cycle. I wanted to first start just quickly with this graphic and highlighting a recent finding by NOAA's Earth Systems Research Laboratory that in 2020, we saw an increase in atmospheric methane. This increase to me was kind of unprecedented or surprising, I guess, because I would have expected atmospheric methane emissions, especially from oil and gas during the pandemic, to either decrease or at least level off. But this rise in atmospheric methane that was observed is the largest in our measurement record, 14.7 parts per billion. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the source of this increase, and maybe you've already talked about it in your atmospheric group quite a bit. There's other folks on the line who probably can talk about it in more detail, but I think there is evidence from my understanding that that the isotopic composition of methane is decreasing over this time period and really over the last decade or so. And what that indicates is that there is an increasing microbial source that is probably responsible for this rise in methane. That microbial source could be from the warming Arctic, but it could also potentially be from flooding in tropical regions or from ruminants. But I think what it also helps highlights that is that atmospheric measurements of the concentration and the isotopic signature can help us identify the changes in sources over time, so the Arctic changing, but also that there are still many gaps in our knowledge of how these sources might change and the isotopic composition over time. And so that sort of comes to introduce the project that I'm going to talk about today a little bit, and then a few others, is this From Archaea to the Atmosphere interdisciplinary science project that's funded by NASA. The primary goal of A2A is to conduct field measurements and collect data that, or collect information that's been measurements that have been collected over long term to calibrate a biogeochemical model, and then that's DNDC. This model has been updated to allow us to estimate emissions of methane as well as the isotopic composition of those emissions. It's usually run on pretty small scale areas, and so our goal was to calibrate this and then validate it using field measurements at one primary site, but then at other sites across the Arctic. We do this first by starting at that primary site, but I should also mention that this is a collaboration with the global Peatland Microbiome project. And so this particular project was collecting information on below ground microbial communities across the globe. And so we actually work with them to identify sites across the Arctic where they've done work, so that we didn't necessarily have to take our own microbiology samples, because that is a pretty time intensive and labor intensive process. And so the first site that we really have focused on is where we've done a large amount of research, which is Stordahl and Meyer. And this is a model ecosystem really for us to test some of our hypotheses, really on how these ecosystems are changing with permafrost thaw, and also how northern wetlands are behaving. We've done research at this site for many decades. It's located in the discontinuous permafrost region of northern Sweden, as you can see from this image here. And there's been research ongoing here since the early 1900s, as well as trace gas emission measurements since the early 1970s. So it's been pretty well classified with respect to the land cover as well as trace gas emissions. But in the work that we've done here, we've added some other components to that. Our research at this site is really focused on three primary land cover types. These are palsa or dry permafrost, bogs that are really sphagnum dominated and have some permafrost below them. And then we also have areas that are fully thawed, which are dominated by sedge type vegetation that are called fens. What we see at these three sites is that we have measurements of emissions. And so there's a lot on this graphic, so I'll try to walk you through it. So this top graphic is really looking at those three different vegetation types, palsa, bog, and fen, and we're looking at low fluxes of methane over time, Bogs have slightly higher fluxes, and fens are really the big emitters. So those are the ones that you're going to really want to watch if you're interested in how much methane is coming out of these ecosystems. We've also been making isotopic emission measurements at this site with these increased ability to make sort of continuous measurements of isotopes. And what we see is that in the bog areas, we see isotopic emissions around -75 per mil. And in the fen areas, it's much closer to -60 per mil. So we are seeing differences in isotopic emissions based on land cover type and also permafrost status. We also see in our microbial community sampling that we see different microbial communities. And so we're seeing this real linkage between this below ground communities with the land cover that we observe and the fluxes and isotopes across this ecosystem. And one thing that we've done more recently in our more recent experience is actually looking out across the mire. So the measurements I just showed you were really from 3 primary locations where we have auto chamber measurements happening and doing a lot of measurements at those. But as we expand our look and view across the mire, we did a microbial community composition sampling and plant community composition sampling using basically quadrats to identify the plant communities and cores to look at the DNA of the microbial communities. And so what we see with this hopefully not too confusing graphic on the right-hand side is that we see really strong correlation between the above ground, which are the lighter color dots, to the below ground communities, which are the darker ones. And our correlation coefficient for this analysis is 0.75 at the shallow locations. So these locations that are closer to the surface show that the microbial communities are related to the plant communities. And that's really a pretty critical finding, because oftentimes what we're doing to try to scale across the Arctic is using those plant communities that we can see using remote sensing that you really can't remotely sense microbes, but this is actually showing that strong link between below ground methanogens, so the microbes that are making methane, and the above ground plant communities. We also see across the mire this, as I mentioned before, auto chamber measurements where we're seeing really strong correlations between the fluxes based on the land cover types. So pulses have low fluxes, bogs have slightly higher, and the fens have a wide range of flux, but this is also a much higher emission to the atmosphere, as well as their isotopic compositions are actually pretty well constrained. Obviously, there's a lot of error, but when you're thinking about how these ecosystems might be changing over time, you need these kinds of data to be able to scale because you can't make those measurements, in every location. So we take these plot-based measurements and we try to scale across the mire more. And there's a lot of colors going on here, so I apologize for not being as consistent across them. But if you look in this left-hand image, what you see in dark blue, those are lakes. And so we're looking at this sort of center mire area here. There's permafrost pulsa in the middle. This is land cover maps that we use, we're basically created by using a artificial neural network of a Worldview 2 satellite image and also ground-based plot measurements. And so we've created this land cover map. And then what we've done is basically a sort of paint by number kind of, in quotes, emission estimate for the whole mire. And so we take those measured values I just showed you and create a map of methane emissions across this ecosystem. And these are just the daily numbers, but we have annual estimates as well. What we can also do with this land cover map is feed it into essentially as a driver into our DNDC model. And we can also, along with a water table data and climate data, create emission estimates using the model across the mire. And what you can see through these two different ways to estimate methane emissions is that we see some differences. The range of fluxes are smaller using the model, and we also see some difference, especially in this area, which is really where our fen is, which we expect to see high emissions. We see a lot here, but here we're seeing some differences based on using the model. Those differences are really driven by the fact that we have different geochemistry driven by water table. And so if you can integrate water table, which is a real strong driver for methane emissions, into these models, should be able to get a better estimate of methane emissions from this landscape. We can also get methane isotopic emissions from this landscape as well. And in this really fine scale, like 1 meter 1 meter scale. And so this kind of, the ability to do this on a larger scale will help us, I think, atmospheric modelers interpret the isotopic emissions or isotopic ratios that they're seeing. So we can take this approach now and go to some other sites across the Arctic. And so we've worked in Alaska, the Northwest Territories, and Alberta with our collaborators, along with the Global Peatland Microbiome Project, as I mentioned. We've been really excited to work with PIs, with grad students and postdocs at these sites who can introduce us to the major land cover classes, help us get access, as well as help us interpret some of the data that we're collecting, as well as provide the longer term data that they've collected to help us validate the model. What we're seeing at these sites is that we are seeing in our preliminary work on the pore water methane, isotopic methane, we are seeing differences based on land cover types. And this PULSA, you see a really wide range, which is somewhat problematic, except that when you remember that pulsars don't emit a lot of methane, it's probably not impacting the atmosphere as much. We're probably seeing the biggest impact on the atmosphere from our fen sites, which have the highest fluxes, but we also see this distinct difference. And so we saw it at Stordahl and Meyer with a lot of measurements. And these are actually measurements that are combined across all of those sites that we've worked at. We've also looked at some of the microbial communities, and this graphic is basically showing those same pore water measurements that we have plotted here versus the relative abundance of acetoclastic methanogens. And so acetoclastic methanogens are a type of methanogen that uses acetate to make methane, and they emit a specific, they actually differentiate with respect to C13 from hydrogenotrophic methanogens. And I won't go into that in too much detail, but what we do see is a really nice correlation between those areas that are bogs in blue and fens in, bogs in green and fens in blue, and the relative abundance of these methanogens. And so what that also tells you is that those emissions that we're measuring are really being driven by those microbial communities below ground, and it's all related to that land cover. And so because we have this very strong above ground and below ground linkage, we can use the models and we can scale using models to scale emission using models. And so our next steps, given the pandemic, we've gotten kind of behind, of course, and Barry's my program officer, so I can admit that to him, I guess, in public. But our next steps are really to do our pan-Arctic emission estimates. And so we're bringing on a postdoc this summer who's going to work with this Boreal Arctic Wetland Lake database, which she helped develop. So Mackenzie Kuhn has worked with David Alfeld to develop this land cover map of different land cover classes. And I'm just showing you bogs, so permafrost bogs, bogs and fens. And she's done a really nice assessment of essentially methane emissions from those 3 categories. And then we're also working with the Permafrost Carbon Network leading an isotope synthesis activity where we're taking all the isotopic measurements that have been published and trying to identify these categories of Pulsa, bog, and fen so that we can use these as an inventory, basically an inventory approach to estimate emissions across the Arctic. Now we're going to compare that then with our estimates using water table data and climate data to also model that. So using this really nice land cover map that's been developed using expert opinion as well as, or expert assessment as well as machine learning. So we'll have 2 ways that we can look at emissions, both fluxes and isotopes when we complete this analysis. And so we'll be looking for that probably early in the next new year, but we're excited to work with Mackenzie and David to integrate this analysis to our work. And I guess I will wrap up just by saying thank you and also happy to answer questions if I can. I'm a trace gas biogeochemist, so the microbe questions might be a little hard for me, but I'm happy to try. So.
Thank you, Ruth. We're going to save the questions until the end.
Okay.
But we did have someone ask for help with your citations. So maybe.
Oh, I'm happy to share those. Yep, I can.
Okay.
Those. Yep.
Excellent. So Clayton Elder is a postdoc at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I briefly met Clayton several years ago when he was an undergraduate student. I'm excited to see him all grown up and doing exciting work on airborne methane observations and fluxes using a remote sensing technique. Clayton, could you tell us more about this top-down measurement of methane in Arctic regions?
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, and let me see if I can get my screen properly shared here. Okay. Can you all see the slide?
Yeah.
Slide? Okay, great.
Yeah, it's full screen now, so you're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that was a great first presentation to kick this off, and Ruth's work is a little bit closer to sort of what I did during my PhD, but since moving to JPL, I've transitioned into using remote sensing and specifically trying to use a really new technique to try to learn more about spatial patterns of methane fluxes across orders of magnitude of spatial scales. So as you said, my name's Clayton Elder. I'm a postdoc at JPL now. I work really closely with Chip Miller at JPL, but I also want to acknowledge the many other collaborators and co-authors that have contributed to this work. Yeah, we're going to be talking about how we characterize methane emission hotspots across Arctic and boreal North America using hyperspectral remote sensing. So I think a major distinction transitioning from Ruth's presentation is using this technique, and I'll change my slide here. Using this technique, we can't really detect total fluxes from a given ecosystem, but the power that we do bring is that we can pinpoint locations that are emitting the highest levels of methane flux. And we've generated a massive data set now. And so I'll get into that in just a minute. But I thought this is one of my styles. I like to throw my key takeaways right up at the beginning so they can stick in your all's minds as we go through the presentation. So we use this novel technique to identify hotspot patterns across diverse wetlands in Arctic and boreal Alaska and Northwest Canada. We followed up a lot of our remote detections with ground-based methane flux observations, revealing extreme methane fluxes at a particular site that we have associated with talc formation and thermokarst undercutting. On a broader scale, looking at our large data set, we're able to uncover some emergent spatial patterns in relation to geomorphology. And this last point, I think, is kind of the discussion topic and really represents the future of this data set that I'm going to talk about. And it's that we can simultaneously study fine scale methane emission heterogeneity and broad scale sort of emergent patterns by combining this higher resolution remote sensing with sort of the total area that we've covered so far. And really this represents a major technological advance in terms of emission scaling, because we're always trying to gap fill in areas where we don't have direct observations, and it's been quite a challenge to accurately scale methane emissions across the Pan-Arctic, and so we think we can provide some spatial clues. So a little more background. We all know the Arctic is changing faster than anywhere on Earth, 2 to 3 times the warming rates of the global average, which is leading to abrupt permafrost thaw in sort of a nonlinear fashion, which includes these discrete sites of intensely thawing and subsiding ground, which are associated with high methane emissions. As I said a moment ago, current emission estimates carry very large uncertainty, and this is really due to our incomplete ability to scale fluxes across heterogeneous environments and really constraining those spatiotemporal scales has been a challenge. And so in this new approach, using NASA's Airborne Visible Infrared Imaging Spectrometer, next generation, ABRIS for short, we're able to detect methane hotspots at 5-meter pixel resolution over tens of thousands of square kilometers at this point. And so we're really bridging a lot of scale gaps there, and we're kind of at the tip of the iceberg in terms of investigating methane patterns. So quickly on how the sensor works, it's able to detect methane enhancements in between the surface and the aircraft. And we fly over a scene, and we're measuring methane absorption in between the ground and the aircraft in the shortwave infrared wavelengths. And so we're able to determine background values and then pinpoint sites that have extra methane above the background in a given location. And so I should mention that because we're looking at shortwave infrared absorption, and that because water surfaces do not reflect that specific energy wavelength, we're unable to detect methane over water surfaces. However, we're able to observe right up to the water's edge, including in areas that are inundated but have enough of a sort of emergent reflective vegetation canopy that we can still make measurements. And that really is kind of a critical zone for methane flux anyway. So let's see, I'll go ahead and advance. And I should mention that also this technique was really developed to pinpoint anthropogenic point sources, and which are leaky pipes spewing out basically pure methane, over typically sandy or somewhat homogeneous backgrounds. And so we're pushing the limit of this technology for investigating ecological methane emissions. But I like to show this slide now. This is a recent image from a colleague of mine at JPL, Daniel Cusworth, recently taken over an oil and gas field in Western Texas, and really just demonstrating, the ability to pinpoint these plume sources over an oil field. So transition back to the Arctic now. So this is a map showing areas that we've covered in the above domain. So all of this work is funded by the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, which is a large-scale, multi-year project that is funded through the Terrestrial Ecology Program at NASA. And our airborne coverage with the ABRIS spans the entire permafrost gradient in North America. And you can see we have individual flight lines, which target key ground-based study sites, as well as these larger sort of mosaic images, which are meant to sort of canvas an entire region that's maybe the size of, a large-scale land Earth system model grid, pixel grid. So an example of one of those is this is probably about 20 flight lines that have been stitched together over the McKenzie Delta and Northwest Territories. And in these grayscale images, the bright areas represent methane enhancement. And so, we get this sort of comprehensive picture of this very large area, tens of thousands of square kilometers. And then as you zoom in, you can start to pick out fine scale structure associated with these dark regions are blacked out. These are the areas of water, associated with thawing permafrost on the banks of thermokarst lakes and whatnot. So that's a little example there. Our first key result, we took all of the data from 2017, which was almost 1 billion individual pixels. And we sort of asked the question, if we take every methane hotspot that we found and determine its distance to the nearest standing water body, and then throw it on a plot, this is what we have on the left, what does that shape look like? And what can we learn in terms of emergent spatial behavior of methane hotspots? And so the y-axis here is the Poisson rate. It's kind of a fancy word for just hotspot occurrence. And each point represents every pixel at that distance of standing water in the entire data set. And the significance of this result is that, you know, we really treat it as an emergent pattern because of the millions of observations that went into it. But we see a 2-component power law relationship that has a kink right at 35 meters. And we've been scratching our heads about, you know, why does that kink exist? And how does that relate to other geomorphological or ecological controls that we use to model methane fluxes across the Pan-Arctic? And you know, I have a lot more material to show we probably won't have time for, but we think this is related to sort of the average water table position and the average sort of slope change surrounding open water surfaces, and how that really acts to mitigate methane fluxes on this sort of fine scale spatial domain. So transitioning to a smaller scale study, we've been able to concentrate on an individual hotspot detection at a thermokarst lake outside of Fairbanks, Alaska, which allowed us to quantify flux rates that are necessary to produce the airborne detections with the AVERS spectrometer. So what we're seeing here in this multi-panel figure, the grayscales are sort of the raw spectrometer output. And then on the right are RGB channels from the same image, and then overlaid with the methane column enhancement. And we were able to overfly the site, I think about 18 times. And we found a consistent hotspot on the shoreline of this pond near Big Trail Lake. And it showed up, I think, in about 75% of our overflights. And that allowed us to sort of target that site with ground-based flux monitoring using closed chambers. And the goal was really to put actual flux numbers on the airborne enhancement detections, which aren't exactly fluxes, because you have to, in order to derive fluxes, some modeling is involved and some assumptions about atmospheric conditions come into play. But really the point is that we measured extreme diffusive fluxes from this area. So what we're seeing here is the red box represents that in situ data set from within the hotspot, compared against a Pan-Arctic methane flux data set compiled by David Olefelt, breaking down methane fluxes by different wetland ecosystem types. And notice this, the x-axis is in logarithmic space here, and that these observed fluxes are in kind of a category of their own, including a handful of fluxes over 10,000 milligrams per meter squared per day, which will be some of the highest reported fluxes when they're published from the Pan-Arctic domain, and rival high fluxes actually from tropical wetlands. And so the kind of the beauty of the AVERS approach is, while it can't measure lower level fluxes, it can show you exactly where the most intense fluxes are happening. And now that we have this data set sort of spanning many regions in the above domain, we can start to figure out why those regions are acting in this extreme way. And so what we were able to do so far was, just at our field site, enlisting the help of some USGS scientists that came out and did a electrical resistance tomography survey. And that's the colorful cross section that you see in the bottom of this figure. And basically we found a thaw bulb extending to a depth of 15 to 20 meters below the site, as well as a thermokarst undercutting feature, which you can kind of see the shape of this resistivity angling away from the east side pond, the sort of thawed region. And we're speculating that, these hotspots might be generated or manifest at the surface, where there's a larger methanogenic zone underneath the surface that could be creating these preferential flow paths that potentially allow methane to channel into like more intense spatial locations at the surface, past intact ice wedges and permafrost, which could potentially encourage these extreme emissions that we're seeing. So Going from there, we wanted to make an attempt to try to take this relationship between thermokarst, rapidly thawing permafrost, extreme methane emissions, and try to upscale to the rest of the above domain and the Pan-Arctic based off of known areas of very high thermokarst occurrence. So I'll walk you through this slide. The map on the left is the same above domain. And then the colored regions are areas that have been classified previously by Olafelt 2016 as areas that are highly susceptible to either lake or wetland type thermokarst. And we had pretty good overlap with a lot of these representative regions. And I should note that just for comparison, the kind of yellow color are areas that have low. So we are just looking at very high and low category here. And if we take our flight lines over those regions and plot the hotspot occurrence ratio for each one of those flight lines, we can see that areas that have very high wetland thermokarst and lake thermokarst tend to occur sort of in the higher hotspot thresholds, and the lower regions with less thermokarst fall into sort of a lower hotspot occurrence ratio. So this gave us confidence that we were, what we're able to detect with the AVERS NextGen likely has something to do with these extreme emissions that are promoted by thermokarst features. And luckily, this thermokarst mapping product from Olafelt spans the entire Pan-Arctic. And so taking those sort of hotspot occurrence ratio metrics, multiplying them by the areas identified by Olafelt et al., and another technique that used metrics from another paper by Turetsky, we're able to start to put some flux numbers on sort of Pan-Arctic hotspot emissions if we use the flux metrics that we took from our in situ survey. So I don't expect you to read through this table, but the take home is that thermokarst hotspots like the ones we've been investigating are likely responsible for around 1 teragram of methane emissions per year across the Pan-Arctic, which is roughly 4% of our current sort of best estimate of wetland methane emissions across the Pan-Arctic, but from a minuscule spatial area. And so I think what this work demonstrates is that it's not necessarily helping us in terms of this extreme spatial heterogeneity problem, but it's highlighting the fact that without considering hotspot behavior and these sort of discrete sites of really intense emissions, that our Pan-Arctic estimates can be off by large quantities. And so we're sort of excited to see where the work goes from there. I'll throw my key takeaways up again. We use the airborne imaging spectroscopy to identify sites of extreme fluxes. We have a lot of opportunity to identify emergent spatial patterns in relation to geomorphology, and that this technique is kind of showing promise for helping our spatiotemporal emission scaling problem. And just a few highlights for the future. We're hoping to release the above methane hotspot data set coming soon, hopefully by the end of the year. It will accompany a publication that explains how to use the data and some caveats that are involved. Colleagues of mine are developing other scientific papers related to this data set, focusing on other aspects of geomorphology. And another one I'm particularly excited about that's led by a former NASA summer student intern named Elsa Yosef, looking at this interesting pattern that we found in relation to tundra fire and how that affects our detection of hotspots. And I think I'll wrap up with a forward-looking aspect of this work, is that we're really trying to understand these scaling challenges in light of upcoming orbiting missions that will use similar technology to the AVERS and have similar spatial scales, but give us that global coverage to actually fill in those areas that we haven't observed yet across the Pan-Arctic. So with that, I will wrap up and hopefully we have a little bit of time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder. You stole my first question. I was going to be asking about the carbon mapper and GHG sat and methane sat, all the new in the next 5 years or so remote sensing capabilities that are going to tie in well, satellite remote sensors that are going to tie in well with the Avarice NG airborne sensor. But why don't we let someone else, questions for Ruth and Clayton? I was great to see the overlap between the two talks. Or someone, Jack has a question. Go ahead, Jack.
I guess I thought you would read it, but I was just curious, Clayton, really fascinating, but you showed a lot of enhancements in the sort of the, the large scale that you looked at, but then you said that, you overflew the east side lake at least 18 or 19 times, and 25% of the time you saw no enhancement there. So if you look across the whole region, how confident can you be at estimating fluxes from Avarice? Since clearly it depends on when you go, right? You may or may not see something at a site that is super hot. But if you had happened to go over East Side Lake one day when it was not hot, you wouldn't have seen it.
Yeah, great question. And in those flights that we did not see the hotspot at that location, I should have specified they were actually flown at higher altitude. And so we had larger pixels and we're a little bit less sensitive at in the higher altitude flights. And so we think that was due likely just to dilution of that enhancement field. But I think your bigger question highlights probably the main weakness of this approach is that we're only getting a snapshot in time when we fly over. And so what we maybe lack in temporal variability, especially in the areas that we didn't have repeat flights, we're hoping we make up for in the spatial domain. Just because we're able to see things at such high resolution, we're capturing kind of that mean state, I suppose, on the days when we fly over. And so, what we lack in the temporal aspect, we're really targeting the kind of the spatial challenge, I guess, of emission scaling.
Well, I guess the question though is, if you flew East Side Lake multiple times, like at different times of day or whatever, I mean, do you even see diurnal variability? Because one of your flights that lasts 5 hours, you might see a lot of hot spots. I don't know, late in the afternoon or early in the morning and less at night. And it's just a really challenging problem for this scaling over the whole of the Arctic, especially comparing the coverage you do have, which is amazing, to how many places that you didn't fly.
Yeah, our Pan-Arctic upscaling exercise has a huge uncertainty, but it's in review right now. But I think would argue that we took two sort of independent upscaling approaches, and they were meant to sort of span those assumptions and take sort of different approaches of how to spatially upscale or even temporally upscale when you only have snapshot type data. But I agree that we can't do much about the temporal variability. However, given the fact that we have over 1 billion pixels to look at this point, that has to make up a little bit for the temporal aspect, I think. But you're right, that is a part of the upscaling that we don't have a great constraint on at the moment.
So Mindy has a question.
High resolution 15.
Yeah.
So I could say, the question was obviously similar to the last about including the venting information, because we have it for all over. We forecast it all the time, and with the new high-res models, at least in Canada, we have the venting index we have to give for permission to burn slash burns. Why can't you just use that? It may not be perfect, but at least it's there every hour. And I mean, you should have conditions where the atmosphere will trap that methane right over the lake more times. You know, it might be emitting at different rates, but it's also certainly trapped and released at different rates.
Yes, definitely. And in our sort of what we found at Big Trail Lake, which is our field site, we did develop a sort of plume stagnation and diffusion model, and fed it the flux rates that we observed from the site. And I probably could show a slide, but maybe it'll save time. I'll just explain it. We do assume that, you know, that in order for the ARCUS to be able to detect methane flux, it has to reach a pretty high concentration in between the sensor and the ground. And so at the flux rates that we observed, you need around 10 to 15 minutes of like plume stagnation time. So that is a major aspect of the detectability of these things. And there are definitely areas, you know, that we fly over that it might have been windy, really windy that day, and, you know, just blew all the methane away. So that's another aspect that we can't constrain very well, but it could be a next step, like taking those modeled hourly resolution wind speeds that you mentioned, and to just slapping flux rates on our sort of positive hotspot detections. We could go in and sort of incorporate those wind speeds to generate, you know, expected air stagnation times at the surface, which could help us sort of constrain the flux quantities a little bit better, instead of just applying sort of you know, 3 different flux rates that we think might be occurring.
Well, if it's any help, like we have in our new weather elements on the grid a whole effort to get venting at the surface. So it's a variable venting at every 2.5 kilometers throughout Canada, every hour. So
that could be highly useful, I think. Yeah.
It might not be correct exactly, but it's supposed to be the best that we can do right now. So.
Yeah, I think that probably yeah, go ahead.
No. This is great. I'm glad to see this high resolution, super high resolution modeling that Canada's doing. Is going to be potentially helpful to Clayton and his team. I wanted to interrupt and say there's other questions. I guess Jack was asking again about Russia, and if there was any, if anyone had any luck collaborating with the Russians to learn more about what methane emission observations have been made over that vast area. And if there's any chance to establish collaborations and get in there to do some work. So this is a question for both Ruth and Clayton.
Maybe I'll defer to Ruth, since she has a few more European colleagues that might have been able to access that part of the world.
Thanks. I think it's really challenging. I have started conversations with a couple of different researchers. I think the challenge for the work that we're doing is that we really need to potentially bring back samples, and that's always a pretty big sticking point. There are folks like in Sweden that are doing research in Russia, so we might be able to collaborate with them, but often there are measurements that you make there, you may need to leave the data, or you can't bring, like in particular, peat samples back or things like that, which we would have to. So we haven't been that successful, but I think I agree with Jack. It's a huge area that needs, I know there are folks doing work there, but I'm not sure that we've successfully collaborate.
Okay, and Chip Miller has some comments. Chip, you want to say them?
Yeah, thanks. We've been very worried about a lot of the questions that have been raised so far with respect to correlating the ARCUS hotspots with actual methane concentrations that one might measure in situ, or with fluxes And to try and address this, we've got a campaign that's probably ready to go, barring the pandemic lasting another year, where DLR and CNES will bring over CHARM-F, which is the Merlin airborne precursor. It's differential absorption LiDAR for methane. We'll also have the MOMAP sensor, which is the CO2M precursor. So that gets both methane and CO2. We'll have ARCUS, we'll have some in situ sampling, and we've been talking with Torsten Zachs from AVI about bringing AirMeth back over again. So having all of those measurements scientifically, especially over places where we already have good ground characterization of the concentrations or fluxes, is going to be really key in terms of understanding what we get from each of the remote sensing capabilities, and knowing how that translates then into space.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I'm glad to see ESA's working with you, Chip. And there was a question. Oh, Javier had a comment to make.
Oh yeah. So no, I was just introducing the PBL. Just don't forget about the PBL, because the actual flux is the combination of surface subsurface process and the interaction with the atmosphere. So the turbulent flux that actually is venting within the PBL, and thereafter within the free atmosphere. And as I discussed with Chip Miller and John Henderson here several times, so our PBLs actually also verify multi-layering, which actually imposes a more complicated problem, actually. But
Great.
Yeah, so
okay.
But yeah, so anyway,
thanks.
The other thing that I just also pointed is the subsea permafrost emission, actually so this is another element that introduces a significant challenge on the modeling community, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's harder to measure using remote sensing over water, so we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, exactly.
This is where so I wanted to give Ruth a chance. She had a question for Clayton. Go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, I guess I was, great talk. I'm really interested in the really high level of fluxes. So you said they were around up to 10,000 milligrams per meter squared per day, which is a massive amount, I think, of methane compared to anything I've measured in the field. And so were those field measurements in that box plot that you showed, those were from flux chambers, or were those the inferred ones from the ARCUS data?
Yes, those were from flux chambers. And we were equally shocked when we saw the numbers coming up as well. And
yes.
you might be familiar with the technique of using like the Los Gatos analyzer. So you can see like the real-time readout
over time. Yeah,
exactly. And
so it's you must have, you did sort of talk about that there might be channeling underneath that's pushing methane to one area where you're actually measuring it. Is that how because that just for production and emission, maybe through parenchyma or maybe bubbling, it just still seems like a tremendous amount of methane. So I'm trying to wrap my head around like how you can physically move that much methane on that scale.
Yes, I've thought about this a lot as well. And I mean, that type of flux rate is more characteristic of like ebullition, like a high ebullition rate. And at this particular site, there is a lot of ebullition, including just right in the water near sort of where we're making the measurements. And so I dug into the research a little bit, but there's kind of some theory about how like episodic releases in the thallic and subsurface actually get translated into more like diffuse, like pulse-like diffuse emission modes. And like when it occurs in water, they come out as bubbles. But we think that in the saturated sort of nearshore environments, there's also these sort of more pulse-like events that are occurring. But because they're coming through this more like dense matrix of the sediments, creates more of a time lag. So there is this like time variability, like ebullition happens like
So,
that.
yeah, so
So
it
I
still
think
looks
it's
like a linear increase over time.
Yeah,
Because it's dampening that ebullition signal or something.
right. So
Interesting.
our time threshold for the diffusive measurement was 45 seconds. So we would reject any measurements that weren't constant for at least 45 seconds. And so, you know, you can debate about whether 45 seconds is long enough or not. But I think that I guess the point is that it's probably another aspect of advection happening in these environments, aside from just our basic model of diffusion that can, you know, and you should be able to take these concentrations that we measured in the chamber and infer the sort of dissolved like pore gas concentration.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think that would probably be useful as a next step. But yeah, we agree that it was pretty shocking to see that level of flux coming out.
So,
I mean,
so
based on our
Colleen,
modeling, yeah.
What's your detection limit from the average NG for a flux?
So that's the question that's really hard to answer, because it does depend on so many environmental factors, like the wind and
right. So no wind,
quality of the retrieval.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say if you let a flux rate of 10,000 milligrams stagnate for about 10 minutes, and it's a bright sunny day, super reflective, that's probably 5 to 10,000 milligrams per meter square per day.
Okay.
Flux rate is like a plausible detection limit. So these really are hotspots that we're finding. Yeah, they have to be extreme. And I think on like looking at all of our data, they occur in like, or at least within, I'm looking at the plot right now, within 35 meters, they occur in like a 0.2% of the entire domain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I feel like you could collect the methane from those places.
Yes, that's definitely on the
I mean, those are the
list.
places you could recover it, or looking at how old it is, determining if it's recent microbial production, because that's
right.
Huge amount of methane. It's pretty amazing.
So,
right.
So then this brings up how much better is the airborne observation going to be compared to the satellite, or is the satellite going to be comparable, or is this TBD?
I think it's TBD, but you know that it's the tricky thing is the spatial scale and the size of the pixels, and deciding on what a true signal is versus what the background noise is. And so what I think will be interesting in the satellite data set is like the next gen satellite technology will not likely be able to see the hotspot we found at Big Trail Lake. However, there are other regions that light up, you know, like 50 AVERS pixels, you know, all at once. And, you know, we've only overflown them like once or twice, but the satellite's going to be able to identify like that next level of hotspot, right? And so there's some spatial heterogeneity at every scale that you look at, and reconciling those scales, I think, is our challenge.
Okay, that's great. It's, you know, it's just like Tropomi is going to see maybe something interesting is going on here, and then AVERS NG will, or whatever, Carbon Mapper will be able to get a closer look, and then maybe we'll still have to fly the airplane out to get some finer details.
Probably so. I mean, Chip is kind of the expert of thinking about the nested approach, the multi-system, multi-sensor approach to you know, finding those scale breakdowns in the observations, I think.
Yeah,
so.
I do think the satellites will be useful for detecting hotspots, areas of interest.
Let me just say that we've got a campaign going on right now, despite the pandemic. AVERS is in Zurich to do some flights that are coordinated for nominally CHIME development, but we're getting Prisma satellite imagery of the sites every day. And Barry, if you can help me convince Jack to let us fly up to Schrodalenmeyer. That would be awesome.
That would be awesome.
Ruth.
That'd be great. We're going to be up there, I hope, this summer.
All right. Well, that's a great idea, Chip. We should talk offline, but we should let everybody get on with their day. I appreciate everyone's time. I know everyone's got too many meetings, and meetings that go over are not appreciated. But great conversations. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you, Barry.